By the time the executive leadership meeting officially began, everyone at Apex Biomedical Systems already knew an announcement was coming. No one said it out loud, of course. Companies like ours never did. News traveled through polished hallways and laboratory floors the same way electricity traveled through a circuit. Quietly at first, then suddenly everywhere. By the time the presentation screen lit up with the words Director of Quality and Validation, the room wasn't filled with surprise. It was filled with expectation. I was one of the people waiting. At 35, I had spent the last 10 years at Apex Biomedical Systems, long enough to recognize the difference between genuine opportunity and carefully managed appearances. I joined the company when it occupied a single manufacturing floor on the outskirts of Minneapolis, back when our production line could barely finish 100 units a week and everyone still believed hard work mattered more than titles. I believed that more than anyone. Back then, we weren't building just another medical device. We were trying to build something hospitals could trust with people's lives. Every calibration report, every validation protocol, every compliance document represented more than paperwork. Somewhere, someday, a patient would depend on that machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. That thought had stayed with me through every late night, every impossible deadline, and every holiday I quietly spent inside the validation lab while everyone else celebrated with their families. My title eventually became Director of Systems Validation, although the title sounded far more impressive than the reality of my daily work. In practice, I spent most of my time preventing disasters before anyone else even realized they existed. When a production line failed calibration 12 hours before shipment, my phone rang. When software updates threatened FDA compliance, people came looking for me. When a hospital reported inconsistent infusion readings or an auditor requested documentation no one else could locate, somehow my name always found its way into the conversation. If Adrian signs off on it, the hospitals can trust it. I had overheard technicians say that more than once over the years. Ironically, I was never important enough for anyone to say it inside an executive meeting. Victor Langford, our founder and CEO, preferred telling a different story. To investors, he was the visionary behind Apex Biomedical Systems. Magazine covers called him an innovator who revolutionized patient safety. Industry conferences invited him to deliver keynote speeches about leadership, innovation, and building cultures of excellence. He accepted every compliment with polished humility, always making success sound like the inevitable result of his brilliant leadership. What those audiences never saw was the army of engineers, validation specialists, quality managers, and manufacturing teams quietly carrying his vision on their backs. They certainly never saw me. For years, I convinced myself that recognition wasn't important. I wasn't chasing applause. I cared about building products that worked. If hospitals trusted our devices, that was enough. Or at least I kept telling myself it was enough. But after 10 years, invisibility begins to feel less like humility and more like permission for people to overlook everything you contribute. There were countless examples. A few months earlier, one of our largest hospital networks reported a firmware synchronization issue that threatened to delay a multi-million-dollar contract. Manufacturing froze. Customer support couldn't explain the problem. Software engineering blamed production, while production blamed quality assurance. Victor walked into the operations floor looking furious. "Where's Adrian?" Someone pointed toward the validation lab. I spent less than 40 minutes tracing the issue back to a corrupted firmware package uploaded during a routine overnight deployment. We rebuilt the validation environment, reran compliance testing, and restarted production before lunch. The contract was saved. That afternoon, Victor sent a company-wide email. Outstanding leadership from Brandon Cole and the operations team for resolving today's manufacturing challenge. Brandon hadn't even entered the lab until everything was already finished. I deleted the email without saying a word. That wasn't unusual. Another time, FDA auditors arrived 2 days earlier than scheduled after another manufacturer in our industry failed a surprise inspection. Half the executive floor disappeared into panic. Documentation was incomplete. Several validation reports needed cross-referencing before they could legally be presented. Victor didn't ask for Brandon. He didn't call any vice president. He looked directly at Diane Keller from Human Resources and said only 3 words. "Get Adrian here." 4 hours later, every document was organized, every discrepancy resolved, and the auditors left without issuing a single observation. Victor thanked the executive leadership team during the closing meeting. I wasn't invited. That became the rhythm of my career. Whenever Apex Biomedical Systems faced a crisis, I was essential. The moment the crisis disappeared, so did I. Over time, I stopped expecting anything different, at least until the director position became available. It wasn't the title that mattered. It was what the position represented. For years, I'd watched Victor pressure departments to rush products through validation before they were truly ready. Every time deadlines became uncomfortable, someone inevitably suggested cutting corners. Do we really need another round of environmental testing? Can't we finalize documentation after shipment? Will the FDA even notice? Every single time, I pushed back. Not because I enjoyed delaying production, because shortcuts inside medical manufacturing don't create unhappy customers. They create unsafe products. More than once, I'd quietly corrected documentation before it reached regulators. More than once, I'd stayed overnight rerunning validation tests because numbers didn't look right. I never announced it. I never embarrassed anyone. I simply believed someone had to protect the integrity of the work. The Director of Quality and Validation would finally have the authority to stop those arguments before they even started. At least, that's what I believed. Lately, though, Victor had become different. Not openly hostile. Something colder. He stopped asking for technical updates directly from me. Executive meetings increasingly included Brandon Cole instead. Brandon had joined Apex barely 2 years earlier. He was confident, polished, articulate, and remarkably good at telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. Investors liked him. Executives loved how comfortable he looked inside a tailored suit. He also asked me questions every week that someone leading regulatory validation should already know. I answered every one of them. Patiently. Professionalism had become second nature. Then Victor began inviting Brandon to meetings I'd attended for years. Investor briefings. Board strategy sessions. Regulatory planning reviews. Whenever I asked whether my presence was needed, Victor smiled politely. We've got it covered. It was such a harmless sentence. Somehow, it carried far more weight than an insult. The final warning came 3 weeks before the announcement. I walked past one of the executive conference rooms carrying a stack of validation reports when I noticed Victor, Brandon, and 2 board members reviewing presentation slides through the glass walls. My presentation slides. I recognized the diagrams immediately. I had spent almost 3 weeks building them. The manufacturing workflow. The validation roadmap. The FDA readiness strategy. Every diagram. Every process map. Every recommendation. Only one thing had changed. The title page. Originally it read, Prepared by Adrian Walker. Now it read, Prepared by Executive Leadership. I stood there for several seconds before quietly continuing down the hallway. No confrontation. No accusation. Just silence. That evening, long after most of the building had emptied, Isaac Turner wandered into the validation lab carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. You've been here since 7 this morning, he said, placing one beside my keyboard. I've had longer days. He leaned against the workbench. You know, everyone thinks you're getting that director position. I smiled without looking away from my monitor. Everyone except the one person making the decision. Isaac didn't laugh. Instead, he looked toward the executive floor through the laboratory windows. I don't trust what's happening up there. Neither did I. But distrust wasn't evidence. Not yet. So I kept working. I reviewed every compliance report, every production validation, every calibration record, every software verification document. If Apex Biomedical Systems was going to face one of the largest FDA certification inspections in company history, I intended to make sure we were ready, regardless of who eventually received the promotion. That had always been my weakness. I couldn't stop caring about the work simply because the people above me had stopped caring about me. 2 mornings later, Victor walked into the validation department for the first time in nearly a month. Everyone instinctively looked up. He rarely visited unless cameras or investors followed behind him. This time, it was just him. He stopped beside my workstation with his usual practice smile. Adrian. Morning. How's FDA readiness? We are ahead of schedule. Manufacturing validation is complete. Software verification passed yesterday. Final compliance review will be finished before Friday. Excellent. He nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. For a brief moment, I wondered whether I'd misjudged everything. Maybe the distance. Maybe the missing meetings. Maybe Brandon's sudden visibility. Maybe I was imagining it. Victor glanced around the department before lowering his voice just enough that only I could hear. Oh, one more thing. I looked up. I'll need Brandon sitting in on tomorrow's executive strategy meeting instead of you. He smiled again. He's going to need a much broader understanding of everything you do. Then he turned around and walked away before I could ask the question that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Why? The executive strategy meeting took place the following afternoon on the top floor of Apex Biomedical Systems. For the first time in nearly a decade, I wasn't invited. I told myself it didn't matter. The FDA certification audit was less than 2 weeks away, and there was still more work waiting than hours left in the day. I buried myself in validation reports, reviewed another round of production records, and signed off on 2 manufacturing batches before lunch. Work had always been the easiest place to hide. Around noon, Isaac stopped by my office. They're still up there. I looked away from my monitor. Who? Victor. Brandon. The board. He hesitated before adding quietly, they've been in that room almost 3 hours. I nodded once. Must be an important meeting. He studied my face for a second, almost disappointed that I wasn't reacting. I just thought you should know. Thanks. After he left, I tried concentrating on the compliance documents in front of me, but the words refused to stay in focus. For 10 years, every major regulatory strategy meeting had included me, not because I wanted executive exposure, but because every important technical decision eventually landed on my desk anyway. Excluding me wasn't simply unusual. It was intentional. Late that afternoon, Brandon appeared in the validation department carrying a leather notebook and wearing the kind of confident smile people wore after receiving good news they weren't ready to share. Hey, Adrian. How'd the meeting go? He smiled wider. Really productive. I'm glad. He lingered awkwardly. You know. He scratched the back of his neck. Victor wants me spending more time down here over the next couple of weeks. I figured. I'll probably have a lot of questions. You usually do. He laughed. I didn't. For a brief moment, something almost resembling guilt crossed his face. Then it disappeared. I appreciate all your help. I looked at him carefully. Brandon wasn't incompetent. That would have made this easier. He was intelligent enough to understand pieces of the system. What he lacked was experience. Medical device validation wasn't something you mastered by reading documentation or attending meetings. It came from years of watching production failures unfold in real time, understanding why regulations existed, and learning which shortcuts eventually became catastrophes. Knowledge like that couldn't be accelerated, no matter how much Victor wanted it to. The following Monday, an email landed in everyone's inbox just after 9 o'clock. Mandatory all-hands meeting. Executive announcement. The entire company gathered inside the manufacturing atrium. Production technicians still wore cleanroom uniforms. Quality engineers stood beside software developers. Managers lined the back wall. Victor stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone who already knew exactly how history would remember the next 5 minutes. I'll keep this brief, he said with his usual polished smile. As Apex Biomedical Systems continues to grow, strong leadership becomes more important than ever. I stood quietly near the middle of the crowd. Victor continued. Our next phase demands fresh ideas, fresh energy, and leaders capable of representing our company at the highest level. Then he smiled toward Brandon. I'm pleased to announce that Brandon Cole has accepted the role of Director of Quality and Validation. For one long second, no one moved. The applause arrived late. Scattered. Forced. I wasn't looking at Victor. I was looking at the engineers. Some stared at the floor. Others exchanged confused glances. A few actually looked embarrassed. Because everyone in that room knew exactly who had built the systems Brandon would now be responsible for leading. Victor extended a congratulatory handshake. Congratulations, Brandon. Brandon accepted it with both hands. Thank you, Victor. Then Victor turned toward me. And Adrian. Every conversation in the room stopped. I'll need you to work closely with Brandon over the next 2 weeks. He smiled as though he were offering me an honor. Make sure he understands every validation process before the FDA inspection. There it was. Not only had I lost the promotion, I had been assigned to train the man who received it. Several people looked at me, waiting, maybe expecting anger, maybe disappointment. Instead, I nodded. Of course. Victor looked relieved. I knew I could count on your professionalism. Professional. That word had become remarkably useful whenever someone wanted to exploit loyalty. The next several days were some of the longest of my career. Every morning, Brandon sat across from me while I walked him through systems that had taken years to develop. Manufacturing validation, software verification, calibration protocols, regulatory documentation, risk analysis, corrective action procedures. He took notes constantly. Sometimes he interrupted with surprisingly thoughtful questions. Other times he asked things so basic that I wondered how Victor could possibly believe he was ready for the role. What happens if validation fails after production starts? We stop production. And if the shipment deadline can't move, we still stop production. But we'd lose millions. I looked directly at him. Better to lose millions than send unsafe devices into hospitals. He hesitated. I guess Victor sees it differently. I know he does. Brandon looked uncomfortable. He changed the subject. By Thursday afternoon, I noticed something else. Several validation reports I'd personally completed had been modified after leaving my office. Not major changes. Tiny ones. Testing dates. Review timestamps. Approval sequences. Enough to raise questions during an audit. I opened the document history. Executive access. Someone had edited the files after I'd already signed them. I printed the reports and walked upstairs. Victor barely looked up when I entered. Something wrong. I placed the documents on his desk. These validation records were changed. So? They can't be. They already were. I took a slow breath. These approval dates no longer match the testing schedule. Victor leaned back in his chair. Adrian. Do you know how many companies miss deadlines because engineers obsess over paperwork? This isn't paperwork. It's compliance. He smiled. Same thing. No, I shook my head. It's the difference between a legal product and a federal investigation. For the first time, his smile disappeared. You're always thinking about worst-case scenarios. My job requires it. My job requires products shipping on time. They aren't mutually exclusive. He stood and slowly walked around the desk until we were standing only a few feet apart. You know what your biggest problem is. I didn't answer. You think being right automatically makes you a leader. The room fell silent. Victor folded his arms. You're incredibly valuable, Adrian. Then he delivered the sentence I'd remember for years. But valuable people aren't always leadership material. It wasn't loud. He didn't insult me. He didn't raise his voice. Somehow, it hurt more than if he had. Because I suddenly understood something I'd been refusing to admit. Nothing I accomplished would ever change his opinion of me. Not another audit. Not another product launch. Not another 10 years. I quietly picked up the reports from his desk. I'll correct the documentation. I know you will. As I reached the door, Victor spoke one last time. Oh, and Adrian. I stopped. Don't make Brandon's transition harder than it needs to be. I looked back. I've spent 10 years making everyone else's job easier. Then I walked out. The FDA inspection was now less than a week away. Despite everything, I stayed late every evening. Not for Victor. Not for Brandon. Not even for Apex. I stayed because somewhere, eventually, our devices would end up beside hospital beds. Patients deserved better than executive politics. If my name was going to disappear from the company, I wanted to leave knowing the work itself remained honest. Friday afternoon arrived quietly. Most people were already thinking about the weekend when a calendar invitation appeared in my inbox. Meeting request. Monday, 4:30 p.m. Conference room C organizer. Diane Keller, Human Resources. No agenda. No explanation. Just 30 minutes. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Across the hallway, I noticed Victor speaking with Diane through the glass wall outside her office. The moment Victor saw me looking, the conversation stopped. Neither of them smiled. Neither waved. Victor simply turned away. I already knew. Monday came faster than I wanted. By 4:25, I had already backed up every document I legally owned, organized every project folder, and left detailed transition notes for Brandon. Old habits. Even after everything, I couldn't leave chaos behind. I knocked once before entering conference room C. Victor was already seated. Diane sat beside him with a folder resting on the table. Neither looked surprised to see me. Neither asked how my day had been. Victor folded his hands. Thanks for coming, Adrian. Something inside me became perfectly still. I didn't sit down. I simply waited. Victor waited until Diane slid the folder across the conference table before speaking again. We've completed a restructuring review. His voice was calm. Professional. The director position has already been filled, and after evaluating future operational needs, we've decided your role is no longer necessary. For a few seconds, I simply looked at him. 10 years. 10 years reduced to a single sentence. Diane quietly pushed a document toward me. Your severance package includes 6 months of salary, continuation of your health benefits, and career transition assistance. Career transition assistance. I almost smiled. After spending a decade making sure one of the country's fastest-growing medical device companies stayed compliant, someone had apparently decided I might need help updating my resume. Victor folded his hands. I hope you understand this isn't personal. I finally looked directly at him. No. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I don't. Silence settled over the room. You asked me to build your validation systems. You asked me to train the person who replaced me. You asked me to prepare this company for the largest FDA certification audit in its history. I paused. And now you're telling me my position isn't necessary. Victor didn't flinch. Companies evolve. No. I picked up the termination letter. People make choices. For the first time since entering the room, Victor's expression hardened. I expected more professionalism. I almost laughed. Professionalism. That word again. Professional enough to sacrifice weekends. Professional enough to miss birthdays. Professional enough to solve everyone else's emergencies. Professional enough to train my own replacement. Apparently not professional enough to deserve honesty. I signed the paperwork. Not because I agreed with it. Because I was done arguing with someone who had already made his decision long before I entered the room. Victor stood. I appreciate everything you've done for Apex. It was the first time he'd thanked me in 10 years. Somehow, it meant absolutely nothing. I handed Diane my company badge. My documentation is complete. The transition notes are finished. Brandon has everything he needs. Victor smiled. I knew you'd do the right thing. I looked at him one last time. I always have. Then I walked out. No dramatic speech. No slammed doors. No angry confrontation. Just 10 years of my life fitting inside a cardboard box. The first few mornings after leaving Apex felt strangely unfamiliar. For the first time in years, nobody called before sunrise asking me to solve a manufacturing problem. Nobody interrupted dinner because production had stopped. Nobody sent emergency emails marked urgent. The silence felt uncomfortable. Then, little by little, it became peaceful. Isaac called me 3 days later. How are you holding up? I've been worse. I wish I could say things are going well here. They aren't. He laughed softly. Brandon keeps asking where everything is. I left detailed documentation. I know. He doesn't understand half of it. I wasn't surprised. Documentation explains processes. Experience explains judgment. Those aren't the same thing. 2 days later, Sophia Grant asked if we could meet for coffee. I recognized her immediately. She had represented one of the investment firms that frequently attended Apex board presentations. I've wanted to speak with you for months, she admitted after we sat down. I wasn't sure you'd take the meeting while you still work there. You wanted to recruit me. She smiled. I wanted to understand why every technical conversation eventually circled back to one person. I laughed. I'm guessing that person wasn't Victor. No. It was always Adrian. She leaned forward. Every engineer we interviewed respected you. Every quality manager trusted your judgment. Even people outside your department kept saying the same thing. If Adrian signs off on it, hospitals can trust it. Hearing those words from someone outside Apex caught me completely off guard. I didn't know people actually remembered that. They did. They just weren't the people making promotion decisions. For the first time since leaving Apex, I felt seen. Not praised. Not flattered. Seen. A week later, the FDA inspection finally began. I watched the news unfold from my apartment. At first, there wasn't much. Then Isaac called. They've already stopped production. What happened? Validation records don't match manufacturing logs. I frowned. That shouldn't happen. It gets worse. Apparently Brandon couldn't explain why certain approval dates conflicted with equipment calibration records. Manufacturing blamed quality. Quality blamed engineering. Engineering blamed regulatory. Nobody seemed to understand how the entire system connected. Because for years, I had quietly been the person connecting all of it. Not because I wanted control. Because someone had to. 3 days later, another headline appeared. FDA extends review of Apex Biomedical Systems certification. Stock analysts immediately began asking questions. Investors demanded answers. The board ordered an independent internal investigation. That was when everything started unraveling. Samuel Brooks, the independent board member, requested a full audit of historical validation records. Not just recent files. Everything. Investigators quickly discovered approval dates that had been changed after testing. Electronic signatures appearing on reports before validation had actually occurred. Compliance records modified without authorization. Several documents contained executive-level access logs linked directly to Victor Langford's account. When questioned, Victor claimed the changes had been administrative corrections. Unfortunately for him, federal investigators tend to verify explanations before believing them. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. Internal emails surfaced showing repeated pressure to accelerate product releases before validation had been completed. Quality findings had been removed from official reports. Regulatory concerns had been intentionally downgraded. One investigator later described the pattern as systematic manipulation of compliance documentation. Victor hadn't merely ignored regulations. He had rewritten them whenever they became inconvenient. Brandon eventually admitted he had never authorized many of the reports submitted under his department. He also admitted something else. Most of those systems. Adrian built them. Ironically, the man chosen to replace me became one of the people confirming how indispensable I'd actually been. A month later, federal prosecutors announced formal criminal charges. Wire fraud, false statements to federal regulators, obstruction of an official investigation, falsification of regulated compliance records. The morning Victor Langford was arrested, every major business news network carried the story. I watched exactly 30 seconds before turning the television off. Not because I felt sorry for him. Because I didn't feel anything. The anger I'd carried for weeks had quietly disappeared. Justice has a strange way of making revenge feel unnecessary. About 2 months later, Sophia called again. I have a proposal. I'm listening. I don't want you fixing broken companies anymore. She smiled. I want you to build one. That conversation became the beginning of something I never imagined. Instead of joining another corporation, we started our own. A small medical device company built around one principle that seemed strangely revolutionary. Integrity would never lose to deadlines. Isaac became our first engineering hire. Within a few months, several former Apex employees reached out asking whether we had open positions. None of them mentioned salaries first. They asked about culture. That told me everything I needed to know. Almost a year later, our first infusion system completed FDA certification. 0 major observations. 0 compliance findings. When the final approval letter arrived, nobody celebrated with champagne. We simply looked at one another, smiled, then went back to work. Because that had always been the point. Not recognition. Not headlines. Doing the work the right way. Several weeks after our launch, a business journalist interviewed me. Toward the end, she asked the question everyone else seemed interested in. Do you feel like you finally got your revenge against Victor Langford? I thought about it for a moment. Then I shook my head. No. She looked surprised. I finally got my freedom. She lowered her notebook. What do you mean? For years, I thought success meant convincing the wrong people to appreciate my work. I smiled. It turns out success is building something where I never have to ask for that appreciation in the first place. Looking back now, getting fired felt like the worst day of my life. It wasn't. It was simply the day someone else made a decision that forced me to make a better one. People often imagine revenge as watching someone who hurt you lose everything they built. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes justice catches up with people who spend years believing they're untouchable. But the greatest victory isn't watching someone else's life fall apart. It's waking up one morning and realizing their opinion no longer has the power to define yours. Victor Langford lost a company. I found a life. And in the end, I think I was the one who had the final laugh.